There's a conversation about your industry happening right now, and you're almost certainly not in it. It's not happening on a call, it's not happening in a meeting, it's happening inside your buyer's head. They're quietly framing a problem, deciding what matters, forming opinions about who's credible. And here's the thing that should change how you think about marketing forever. Whoever owns the conversation in the buyer's head owns the sale long before anyone ever picks up the phone. Most businesses pour all their energy into the visible conversation, the sales call, the proposal, the pitch. But by the time that conversation happens, the real one, the internal one, has almost already decided the outcome. This is conversation ownership, one of the most powerful core ideas in the conversion ecosystem. This is because it moves the battleground from the sales call that you could see to the internal dialogue that you can't. If you run a business, especially if you're a founder or you sell professional services, this matters more than almost anything that you'll ever hear about marketing this year, because your buyers are having this conversation with themselves quietly long before anyone has reached out to you or anyone else. In this video, I'm going to show you what this internal conversation is, how it forms, and why owning it quietly wins you the deals before they begin. Then I'm going to show you exactly how you're going to go about owning it yourself. Most of what decides whether they call you happens where you can't see it, and you can't sell to it. I spent 27 years in B2B marketing, and the businesses that win most deals are almost never the ones with the best pitch. They're the ones who are in the buyer's head before the buyer went looking. This is one piece of what I call the silent race, the competition for your buyer's trust that happens before contact. The conversion ecosystem is how you win it, and what you're about to learn is where that win actually starts. Let me start by making this internal conversation real, because it's easy to dismiss it as a metaphor when it's actually the most concrete force in buying. Every time a buyer has a problem that you could solve, a conversation begins in their mind. What exactly is the problem? How serious is it? What's a good solution look like? Who could help with this? Who can I trust? Is now the time? That ongoing internal dialogue is the conversation, and it runs for weeks or even months before any outside conversation happens. And here's the crucial point. That conversation is where the decision actually gets made. By the time a buyer contacts you, they've usually already had hundreds of small exchanges with themselves about what they need and who is likely to provide it. They have framed the problem, set the criteria, and form the learning. The sales call does not create the decision. It mostly confirms one, the one that was already shaped in private. Now compare the two conversations. The visible one, the sales call is short, late, and happens once the decision is nearly made. The invisible one, inside a buyer's head, is long, early, and happens while the decision is still wide open and forming. We obsess over the visible one because it's the part that we can see, and it's the part that we could take part in. But the invisible one is where the real influence lives, exactly because it's happening while the buyer is still deciding. And here's what almost everybody misses. That internal conversation is never empty, and it's never neutral. Someone is shaping it. Someone taught the buyer how to think about the problem, what questions matter, what good looks like, who to trust. The buyer rarely comes up with this alone. They pick it up from the content they consume, the expert, the sources that they run into. The only question is, whose voice is that? Is it yours or is it your competitors? Or maybe it's some generic industry information that serves no one in particular. Conversation ownership is simply this, being the voice that shapes that internal conversation. When you own it, the buyer is, in effect, thinking your thoughts as they decide. And a buyer that's thinking your thoughts tends to land on your conclusion. To own the conversation, you have to understand how it forms, stage by stage, because you influence it differently at each stage. It begins at the very first moment a buyer recognizes a problem. Sometimes this is called the zero moment of truth. Something shifts in their world, and they realize they have a need. At this instant, the conversation in their head opens, usually with confusion. I have a problem, but I'm not even sure how to think about it. Then comes the long, messy middle. The buyer researches privately and almost continuously. They loop between exploring options and weighing them, gathering information and comparing, second guessing and circling back. This is where most of the internal conversation happens. And it's messy because the buyer is still figuring out how to think about the whole thing. They're forming their criteria. they're forming their opinions, they're forming their learnings. All of this is being shaped by whatever sources they encounter along the way. Now notice the opportunity hidden inside that messiness. A buyer in the middle is actively looking for a way to make sense of their problem. They're hungry for a framework, a way of thinking that brings order to their confusion. Whoever gives them that framework, whoever helps them make sense of it all, gains enormous influence over the conversation because the buyer adopts that way of thinking and then it uses it to judge everything else, including every competitor. Finally, there's a tipping point. The moment the buyer feels confident enough to decide and to act. By the time they reach this point, the conversation in their head has mostly been resolved. They know about how to think about their problem, they know about what they want, and they already know who they're leaning towards. The tipping point is not a fresh decision. It's more of a conversation that their internal dialogue has been building towards. So the conversation forms across 3 stages. It opens at the problem recognition, it grows through the messy middle, and it resolves at the tipping point. And here's the strategic payoff. The earlier you enter the conversation, the more you get to shape it. You get to influence the buyer at the problem recognition stage and through the messy middle, while their thinking is still forming, and you get to shape the criteria that they'll eventually use to decide. If you show up at the tipping point, you just become one more option being judged by the criteria someone else has already created. Let me make ownership concrete because it's much more specific than being simply visible or putting content out there. To own the conversation means the buyer is using your way of thinking, your framework, your criteria to make their decision. Your perspective has become the lens that they see the whole problem through, and the lens they judge every other option by. That's very different, and you're in a much more powerful position than simply being one of the voices that's being heard. And here's what it looks like in practice. When you own the conversation, the buyer starts asking the exact questions that you taught them to ask. Questions that, not by accident, you happen to answer better than anyone else. They judge options using the criteria that you set, the criteria that naturally favors your strengths. You then define a good solution using the terms that you gave them. You have not sold them anything yet, but the deck is stacked already in your favor because they're judging the entire field by your standards. Think about how powerful that is. Most businesses show up and they argue that they're the best option, according to whatever criteria the buyer already has. When you own the conversation, you do something far more effective. You shape the criteria themselves in advance, so becoming the best option becomes almost automatic. You're not winning the argument, you wrote the rules of the argument before it even started. And this is why owning the conversation is so much more powerful than having a great pitch. A pitch that tries to win inside a frame someone already set. Ownership sets the frame. Once a buyer has adopted your way of thinking about a problem, every competitor who comes along gets judged through your lens. And most of them will not measure up to the criteria built around your strength. You've quietly turned the buyer's own thinking into an advocate for you. The businesses that dominate their markets understand this deeply. They're not the loudest business. They are the businesses that patiently taught their market how to think about a problem so thoroughly that when the buying moment arrives, the buyer's own inner voice sounds like a case study for exactly what they do. The buyer feels like they reached their own independent conclusion when in reality, they were thinking the thoughts the owner of the conversation planted long ago. You might be thinking, this sounds great, but isn't it easier to simply become better at selling? That's a fair question, and the answer shows up why conversation ownership matters so much. Selling harder means trying to win the buyer over during the late visible conversation. At that point, their internal conversation has already been resolved. You're pushing against a frame that's already set, and that's exhausting and has low odds. Think about what hard selling actually is. It's an attempt to change someone's mind at the very last moment, to overcome objections, to reframe the problem in your favor. After the buyer has already framed it themselves, you're fighting an uphill battle against that thinking that formed over weeks, inside a single conversation, under time pressure. No wonder it feels like such a struggle. No wonder it often fails. You're trying to do in 30 minutes what should have happened over months. Now compare that with owning the conversation. Here, the buyer arrives at the visible conversation already thinking in your terms, already leaning your way, already trusting you, because your voice has been guiding their thinking all along. There's almost nothing left to overcome because you're no longer pushing against the frame. The frame is already yours. The sale feels less like a persuasion and more like an internal conclusion. This is what people mean when they describe a buyer as being pre-sold. This also explains why some businesses seem to close effortlessly, while others, they fight every single deal. The effortless ones are usually not better closers, they own the conversation. Their buyers arrive already convinced. The businesses that struggle are trying to build inside one meeting the trust and the framing that should have been built across the entire buying journey. The sales skills may be identical, the difficulty is not, because one business owns the conversation and the other does not. So the real choice is not between selling well or owning the conversation. The real choice is between fighting uphill inside the visible conversation forever or doing the patient work to own the invisible conversation so the visible one becomes much easier. Owning the conversation does not replace selling, it makes selling almost unnecessary because the real persuasion already happened quietly long before. Fail to own the conversation and you risk the other two forces of the silent race. Invisible loss, which is never making the shortlist, or silent elimination, which is getting removed from the shortlist without ever knowing it happened. So how do you actually do it? Owning the conversation is not mystical. It comes down to a few concrete things done consistently over time. The first is having a clear point of view, a distinct way of thinking about your buyer's problem, one that you become known for. You can't shape a conversation if you have nothing specific to say. Vague Me Too messaging shapes nothing. A clear or even possibly a contrarian point of view gives the buyer a framework to adopt. Deciding what you believe about this problem should be understood. Then say it consistently. The second is consistent presence, especially early in the buyer's journey. Since the conversation forms a problem recognition and through the messy middle, that is where you need to be present with content. And you need to be there with a point of view that helps the buyer make sense of their problem. You can't own a conversation that you only join at the end. You have to be there throughout the entire journey, which means a steady ongoing presence in the places where the buyer researches, not occasional appearances when you happen to need sales. The third is genuine usefulness. You earn the right to shape someone's thinking by actually helping them think. The content that owns conversations is not thinly veiled promotion. It genuinely helps the buyer understand their problems, weigh their options, and make a good decision, even when the decision doesn't obviously point to you. Strangely enough, the more honest and useful you are in shaping the buyer's thinking, the more they trust your framework, and the more the framework naturally favors you because it was built on your real expertise. Put those three together and a pattern appears. You consistently share a clear, genuinely useful point of view in places your buyer researches throughout their journey. Over time, that point of view becomes the way that they think about your problem. Your questions become their questions. Your criteria becomes their criteria. You have owned the conversation, not through manipulation, through being the most useful and the most consistent voice while their thinking was still forming. And notice that this is a long game, not a campaign. You don't own the conversation with one brilliant piece of content. You own it through steady, consistent presence. Presence that gradually becomes the dominant voice in your market's thinking. This is why it's so difficult to copy. A competitor can't copy their way into owning the conversation overnight because ownership is built from sustained presence and trust, both which take time to build. The voice that's been guiding the conversation the longest and is the most useful is very difficult to replace. Let me connect this directly to content because it completely reframes what content is actually for. Most businesses think of content as a way to get attention or visibility. That's true, but it's also shallow. The deeper purpose of content is conversation ownership. Every piece you publish is a chance to shape the conversation in your buyer's mind, to plant a piece of the framework they'll eventually use to judge everyone, including you, when that time comes. This change is what good content actually looks like. If content is about visibility, you optimize for reach and click. If content is about owning the conversation, you optimize for shaping how your buyer thinks. You optimize for installing your point of view, your framework, your criteria into their internal dialogue. A piece of content that reaches few people but reshapes how buyers think is far more valuable than a piece that reaches thousands but shapes nothing. It also explains why consistency and coherence matter so much. A scattered collection of unrelated content shapes no conversation because there's no coherent framework for the buyer to absorb. A body of content that consistently reinforces the same clear point of view from many different angles gradually installs that framework into the buyer's mind. The repetition matters. The consistency matters. The coherence matters. That's what makes the framework stick. You're simply not publishing content. You're building a way of thinking inside your market's collective mind. So the next time you create content, ask yourself a better question. Not how do I get more views? Instead, ask how does this shape the way my buyer thinks about their problem? What question am I teaching them to ask? What criteria am I setting? What part of my framework am I installing? Content created with that intention does something more powerful than generate attention. It quietly takes ownership of the conversation that ultimately decides a sale. And this is the thread that connects conversation ownership to almost everything else in marketing. Your visibility exists to get the conversation. Your content exists to shape it. Your consistency exists to own it. Your trust building exists to make your voice the one that the buyer believes. And all serves one goal: being the voice inside your buyer's head when they decide. I want to push this one step further to the most powerful version of the idea: owning the conversation from start to finish across the buyer's entire journey, not just one moment of it. Many businesses at best influence one stage. They get some visibility at the beginning, or they show up with a good pitch at the end, but the business that truly dominates own the conversation at every single stage, from the first moment of the problem recognition all the way to the final decision. Owning the beginning means being present when the buyer first realizes that they have a problem. It means helping them understand and frame that problem in the first place. If you're the voice that helps them understand what they're actually dealing with, you set the frame before anyone else even enters the conversation. And you define the problem. And whoever defines the problem has an enormous influence over which solution will eventually look right. Owning the middle means becoming the most useful guide throughout the messy research phase. The voice that helps the buyers make sense of their option. The voice that establishes the criteria that they use to judge every alternative. This is where most of the conversation happens, which means this is where most of the ownership is won. You need to become the source that brings order to their confusion. And then buyers will carry your framework with them through every comparison that they make. Owning the finish means being present and trusted at the tipping point. So when the buyer is finally ready to decide, you're already the obvious choice, the safe choice. You're not making a last-minute case. You're simply there, familiar, and trusted. You become the natural conclusion to a conversation that you've been guiding all along. The decision feels to the buyer like their own independent conclusion. That's exactly why it works so well. When you own the conversation from start to finish, something remarkable happens. The buyer's entire journey, from the very first awareness of the problem to the final decision, unfolds inside a frame that you provided, guided by a voice that they trust, towards a conclusion that naturally favors you. You're no longer competing inside the decision, you become the architect of it. That is the fullest expression of conversation ownership. And it's what every part of a serious marketing system is ultimately built to achieve. There's even a way to measure where you currently sit on that journey. It's called the Conversation Ownership Index, a scale that measures whether you're invisible, recognized, trusted, or unavoidable. Now, let's pull everything together. There's a conversation about your industry happening inside the buyer's head. That conversation is where the buyer's decision is actually being made, long before any sales call ever happens. That conversation is never empty. Some voice is shaping how the buyer frames the problem, what questions they ask, what criteria they use, and how and who they're going to trust. Conversation ownership is becoming that voice. The conversation opens at problem recognition. It grows through the messy middle, and it resolves itself at the tipping point. The earlier you enter the conversation, the more influence you have over it. When you own the conversation, your framework becomes the buyer's criteria, which is why it beats trying to sell harder. Because you are no longer pushing against someone else's frame, the frame is already yours. You build conversation ownership through three things: a clear point of view, consistent presence, and then genuine usefulness, built patiently over time through content that shapes how your market thinks. Stop competing only in the conversation that you could see, because the real conversation is already happening in your buyer's head. Own that conversation from start to finish, and you don't have to win the sale. The sale is already leaning your way because the buyer was thinking your thoughts all along. This connects to a much bigger system that I call the conversion ecosystem. Every video on this channel adds another piece to that system, and you'll find more information in the links below. Because the most visible, the most valuable, and the most trusted business in the market wins. The entire purpose of the conversion ecosystem is to build that system that makes you all three.